That's loud. Okay, kia ora, morena. Welcome to session 4. Before I hand over to Rob to talk a bit more about trade and services, I will open with a karakia. Tū taua mai ki runga, tū taua mai ki raro, tū taua mai ki roto, tū taua mai ki waho, kai tau ai te mauri tū, te mauri ora, ki te katoa, homie, huie, tai kie. Okay, so yes, back to trade and services. Over to you, Rob.
Okay, sure, thanks. Okay, well, good morning, everybody, and good afternoon to Suzanne and Gay. Today, well, I want to complete the material that I started yesterday on services. That won't take very long, and then we'll have a breakout session on services, and then we'll move on to the main topic for today, which is free trade agreements and other regional trade agreements, including Asia-Pacific developments, including ASEAN. So to just get to the point on services, what I hope I'd emphasised yesterday was the importance of services, why services are critical to the efficient operation of our economies, why it's very important for services to be efficient. How trade can help us, trade and services can actually help us become more efficient, more competitive, and also the fact that despite the fact that there are obvious benefits to be had by trading more in services, in actual fact, services trade is very heavily restricted. It's much more heavily restricted than goods trade. And so now the obvious question that comes from that is, well, what have we as the international community been doing to try to free up services trade? And so I come now to the two main approaches that have been used at the multilateral level in the WTO to or in big trade agreements like the TPP and the CPTPP to look at the approaches that have been taken. So we have basically two approaches that have been used so far within the global community to try to liberalise services trade. One is the positive list approach, which is often known also as the GATS approach, because it is the GATS approach. It is the approach used in the GATS, and the GATS is, of course, the WTO agreement. But the GATS approach is also used in many free trade agreements, I think often because having put a lot of time and effort into understanding the GATT approach and knowing how to use it and how to manipulate it, governments are not really too keen sometimes to change to a new method of services trade when they start negotiating free trade agreements. So basically the GATS approach is called a positive list approach because the positive list side is that the countries can decide which sectors they are going to liberalise. So we only liberalise those services that you list, and then you make a schedule of commitments, which also allows the reservation of a lot of policy space in most of the equipment. So commitments. So basically, you decide what sectors you are going to liberalise, you make your commitments, but the methodology in the GATS approach is that governments can actually, even though they've said they're going to liberalise services, they can exclude a lot of different aspects of the limit of the barriers onto service trade, even within the sectors that they are agreeing to liberalise. So that and the schedule of commitments allows governments a lot of room to change the restrictiveness of their policies. It's just really like tariffs. I mean, you have the gap between applied tariffs and agreed tariffs. So in the GATS approach, you have the gap between the actual level of liberalisation and what a complete liberalisation would look like. And so what we find in the WTO, very sadly, is that in the GATS, but the countries have bound their restrictiveness at a level which is well above their actual policy. In other words, they are not touching the true restrictiveness of their policies. They're making commitments that limit their restrictiveness to certain levels, but those levels are well above the actual level of restrictiveness in their policy. And worse still, when it came to the Doha round, they were still offering liberalisation or reduction in restrictiveness that still did not get close to the true level of restrictiveness in their policy. And one famous study of that concluded that the offers that WTO members were making in the Doha round contained not one iota of liberalisation of real liberalisation. In the free trade agreements that use the GATS approach, they typically say these will be GATS plus. So you're building on top of a set of commitments that didn't liberalise trade very much. So you obviously wouldn't expect too much liberalisation from further liberalisation in a free trade agreement that was actually using the same approach as the GATS. And sure enough, we find that the WTO plus elements in most FTAs in their GATS provisions are quite small. And one set of researchers actually found that there were some GATS minus elements in quite a number of free trade agreements. The one analysis that you might be familiar with, although it's happened quite a long time ago, there was a analysis about 11 years ago carried out by AREA, two economists in AREA, of the ASEAN plus FTAs as a preliminary to thinking about something like the FTAAP or the RCEP. And basically they found that there was very little WTO plus in the services provisions in the what I'm sure you know as the ASEAN plus free trade agreements. There's also an issue that does irritate quite a few people, that the treatment of investment in a agreement that includes a GATS approach to services can look a little bit incoherent, because you might have an investment chapter in the free trade agreement, but then you also have services commitments on the GATS model with commitments in mode 3, which also involves foreign investment. So and that sort of leads to a certain degree of lack of incoherence in the treatment of investment. Trying to move this forward. There we go. So what we can say about the GATS is that, go back here. What we can say about the GATS is that it basically provides a framework, and that's what it was intended to do. The GATS framework was intended to provide a framework in which a sector-specific approach could be fitted into, and economies could tailor their commitments according to the individual needs, or more accurately, the sensitivities of their economies in particular sectors. So it was basically designed really to allow countries to opt out wherever they wanted to opt out, by not offering to actually reduce the level of restrictiveness of their restrictions in various areas. So not surprisingly, the GATS itself didn't result in extensive liberalisation of services. It was allowed because it allowed members to choose their liberalisation commitments, and most people chose not to engage. Most countries chose not to engage in much genuine liberalisation, and the bindings were often at well below the level of their existing policies. That still had some value, because being bound at a certain level, even though it might be above the restrictiveness of the existing policies, it does provide a degree of certainty to providers to say that the barriers won't go up above that, and that's also perhaps valuable for investors to know that as well. But it does create, just as the gap between bound tariffs and applied tariffs allows policy space in terms of in trade and goods, well, this GATS approach, or the use of the GATS approach by member economies, allows policy space where they could move their restrictions up or down, but still staying above their actual level of restrictiveness. Now, one group of members for which that was not true was really a very it's almost scandalous situation. This applied to the WTO members who were members at the WTO's foundation. They were foundation members of the WTO and the GATS, but the members that joined after that had to go through a process where the existing members were able to demand commitments from the applicants or the acceding countries as the price of their entry into the WTO. And most, if not all, acceding members found that they faced demands to make very extensive commitments on services trade, far beyond anything that the foundation members had required themselves to do. So you find that a lot of developed countries, including some of the Pacific Islands, for example, that I know about, but also in Central Asia and maybe in Southeast Asia as well, when they joined the WTO after it was founded, they had to make a very, very extensive set of commitments on services in their GATS commitments. Very, very unfair situation, although you could also argue that if we believe that liberalising services trade is actually beneficial, we could also say that by being forced to do that, they may have actually increased their benefits from their membership in the WTO. Now, I talked about China before. China made very extensive commitments in its accession package, and that was a deliberate move by the Chinese governments to move their economic reforms in the directions that they wanted to go, including in the services area. They realised that they would, before they entered the accession negotiations, or before the accession negotiations concluded, they realised they were going to have to make big commitments in areas like telecommunications and banking and finance. And so they actually engaged in a series of, if you like, preliminary reforms in those sectors, quite large, quite big reforms in telecommunications and financial services and some other services, to ensure that when the accession did come, once they did join and they had to apply the very extensive commitments they were forced to make, that would not unduly disturb their existing industries. Their industries would be prepared for the new competition. And so those extensive commitments became part of Chinese extensive government policy in the years after its accession to the WTO. So it allowed for the entry of competition in the Chinese market in areas like telecommunications and financial services, banking and financial services. So this is a famous and rather scandalous graph, which shows what I've just been saying graphically. What we're seeing here is countries spread across the graph. You can see across the horizontal axis, it's that countries ranked by their GDP per capita, and on the vertical axis, you can see the level of restrictiveness measured on the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index. And you remember I said yesterday, this is an index where a reading of 0 means that the sector is completely liberalised, completely free trade, and a level of 100 means that trade in that sector is completely blocked. And so all the members of the WTO are plotted on this graph, and a line of best fit is drawn through, first of all, the restrictiveness of their actual policy. That is the red line. And then you have a dark blue line, solid blue line, again drawing through the solid blue dots, which shows the restrictiveness involved in their GATS commitments. And then the dotted blue line shows the restrictiveness involved in what they were offering to do in the Doha round, which of course never completed, and so they never did it. And what you see there is that for the majority of members, and certainly on the average, looking at those lines of best fit, the commitments in the GATS came nowhere near actually requiring any change in actual restrictiveness, because it didn't come anywhere near their existing levels of their actual policy, the restrictiveness of their actual policy. And the offers they were making on the average in the Doha rounds were not going to make very much difference. So, I mean, that graph bounced around the world, and of course it was highly scandalous and shocked everybody, but nothing much happened as a result. So not surprisingly, there's been moves to alternative approaches, and the other alternative is what's now called the negative list approach to liberalising trade and services. And as distinct from the positive list, where you list the sectors you are going to make commitments on, the negative list approach, as the name suggests, you list the sectors that you're not going to make commitments on. Those are the negative listed sectors. And on the sectors that are not on the negative list, you are presumed to make a full commitment to market access and national treatment. I explained what that would involve in the last lecture, basically the same kind of definition of market access as is used in the WTO, and national treatment means treating your foreign partners the same as your local providers. So you make full commitments to market access and national treatment in the sectors that you're not listing, except where, if there are some regulations or protective measures that you want to keep in those sectors, you have to actually specify them. They're called the non-conforming measures. And those non-conforming measures are then bound as commitments at the actual policy restrictiveness. So there's no gap actually for those sectors between the restrictiveness of actual policy and the level at which the restrictiveness is bound. So that's seen as maybe a little bit of an improvement on the GATS approach, the positive list approach, but obviously its effectiveness depends on how long or how short and how significant or not are these negative lists. You could negative list a lot of very important sectors and you would not be covering very much of your services sector. But the commentators say that even if you have a substantial negative list, even so, the commitments do act as a standstill, because you're binding at the level of your existing restrictiveness, which means that you are committing yourself, whether you know it or not to increase the restrictiveness in future. In other words, the policy space is being eliminated there. And then furthermore, there is also often a ratchet provision which says that if you make subsequent reforms in a service sector and reduce the level of restrictiveness, then those reductions in the level of restrictiveness get automatically incorporated into your negative list commitments. So this obviously provides wider coverage of a restrictiveness reduction, trade liberalisation, but commentators were still not very convinced about the depth. In other words, how far did this go across the service sector, and how deep did it go once you look at what was on the negative lists. You also have what typically happens in negative list agreements, or what typically happened in early negative list agreements or services chapters, which often involved the United States in those days when the United States was interested in trade agreements. Typically, the structure in the services and investment provisions was that services provisions would cover cross-border supply. That's mode 1 and mode 2 in the GATS definition, but all investment, both in goods and services, would be covered in the investment provisions. In other words, there would be no mode 3 in the services chapter. What would be mode 3 would be covered in the investment chapter, and the movement of people would also be covered in a separate chapter or even an annex to the agreement, typically headed up temporary movement of business persons. So again, there would be no mode 4 in the services chapter. So this did have a potential advantage of making the treatment of investment more coherent. On the mode 4 issue, the issue there was that in the United States, Congress in those days had much more power perhaps than it has today, or seems to have today. But mode 4 insisted that they had the authority to make decisions on all immigration matters, and they insisted that mode 4 was basically an immigration matter. And so US Congress was not prepared to give a tick to any agreements that included liberalisation in mode 4, because, I mean, the agreements themselves would be negotiated by the president under trade negotiation authority. that Congress used to grant to the US president to allow the president and his officing ministers or his secretaries to negotiate agreements. But Congress didn't want agreements that included Mode 4 being negotiated by the president outside of their control. So they insisted that there could be no Mode 4 in any agreement that would be approved by Congress, and any provisions on movement of persons would be in a separate chapter or even an annex dealing with movement of business persons. So coming back to the question, is this negative loss list an improvement? Well, as you can see, you can say it is an improvement in some ways, but the proof of the pudding, as we say in English, is always in the eating. And the reality, this approach was highlighted. The use of this approach was highlighted in the TPP, and then after the TPP collapsed, the CPTPP, which succeeded it. And these agreements, when they were being negotiated, were being trumpeted, especially, I shouldn't use that word, they were being presented to the world as the gold standard in trade agreements, the ultimate in a trade agreement. But in actual fact, the liberalisation, when the World Bank did the analysis on these two agreements, they found that the service outcome A was far short of the ambition to be a true gold standard agreement, mainly because the negative lists were extensive and in very insignificant areas. And the killer conclusion was that in the World Bank study was that the services provision in the TPP and the CPTPP required very little action by the governments to comply with their commitments on services. In other words, so that tells you if they don't have to take any action on what they've committed, that means that the action they've committed doesn't really mean very much in terms of liberalisation. And that's just as a digression. That's an interesting example of something that's sometimes quite illuminating to do, is when you have a free trade agreement in your country, as we've had them in New Zealand, and the governments in New Zealand have to submit these agreements for approval to Parliament, and they have to produce a national interest assessment to show that they demonstrate that, or supposedly demonstrate that the agreement is in the national interest, and quite often you'll find that the government that is seeking approval for the agreement that's negotiated, one of the phrases that I've quite often seen is the government will say, this agreement requires no legislative action by the government to implement it, or very little legislative action to implement it. Now, if there was any significant liberalisation, then you would expect legislative action for it, so that the government proudly congratulates itself on having a negotiation that results in them having to do nothing. Of course, that's for domestic consumption, to keep quiet all the people who are opposed to the agreement. But because they are able to boast that they don't have to do anything to implement the agreement, that's also really telling you that there can't be very much liberalisation taking place in that agreement. But anyway, that's something to look for when your governments are announcing new trade agreements. What do they say they have to do to implement the agreement? If they say, as some governments do, if they boast that they don't have to do very much or nothing at all, then obviously there won't be very much liberalisation in that agreement. So what other approaches can we find towards services liberalisation? Well,
sorry, Rob, just before you carry on, there was just a question from Rochana about the negative approach. So, and what are some of the sectors that are under the negative list?
Okay. Well, that will differ by agreement, but I mean that will be the result of negotiation. Obviously, countries that want to get access to their partners' markets for services will try to push against the sectors that they're interested in being negative listed, and the countries that don't want competition for the services sector will try to put those sectors on the negative list. So what goes onto the negative list is a matter of negotiation between the parties. But very often in practice, it turns out that um, the sectors that are put on the negative list are actually quite significant, which obviously limits the effectiveness of the agreement. So you have to look at each individual agreement to see what is negative listed, how important are the sectors, and how many of them are there, to get some initial sense of how much real liberalisation is taking place in the services sector as a result of that agreement. Okay, so sorry.
Thank you so much, Professor. So to recap, based on what you have explained, some sector that are under negative list is the sector or the agreements that probably that are unwanted or are unimportant during the negotiation of settling the agreement. If I'm not mistaken, this is what I have understood from.
Say they're not,
Thank you.
they're the result of the negotiation,
I
and
mean, yes, let's go on.
the sectors on the negative list will be the ones that the importing country in each case wants to exclude from the agreement.
Yeah, I get it.
Them.
Uh, uh, why
Very
why uh, why they
very
don't want to include those negative sector? Why they want to exclude this kind of sector, Professor? Because it's really unimportant, or because
well,
it's yes, thank you.
not because it's unimportant. It's because, in fact, it's because it probably is very important to the importing countries, because
Oh,
and they don't want the competition for their service sector.
oh,
So
okay.
it will be the countries that are wanting to open the market up of their trading partner, want to keep the
Oh,
short.
yes.
Don't want to open their markets will probably aim for quite an extensive negative list, because those sectors won't have to liberalise.
Oh, yes, thank you. Without competition, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you so much, Professor. I get it. Thank you so much. Yeah.
That's okay. So it's a very important point, because negative lists approaches are often described as if they are much better than the positive list approach, and in general that's probably true, because negative lists a positive list allows countries to keep the list as short as possible. Negative list looks as though it's requiring only the ones that are going to be excluded to be on the list, but that sometimes is seen as evidence that the governments are more open to freeing up trade, but that's not necessarily the case. The real test is what sectors are on the negative list, and how
Yeah.
important are they. If they put a lot of sectors on the negative list and they're very important sectors, then you know there's not much trade liberalisation taking place.
Thank you. Is it possible if I ask you one more question, or you would like to go on the lecture first?
Okay, no, what's the other question?
Actually, it's really a question that has really come up in my mind a few days already after our session. I would like to know how good governance could help to improve trade facilitation. Yeah,
Uh,
thank you so much.
well, that's really a very, very long topic.
Yeah,
You
thank you.
have to look at all the different elements. If you look at the elements of trade facilitation that I listed in the lecture yesterday, the government wants to facilitate trade, they should
Yeah,
be looking to implement good policies in all of those areas, policies that reduce costs of importing goods, basically. Yeah,
thank you, Professor. Thank you so much. Yeah.
that's all right.
Rob, there was another question in the chat. Thank you for the trade and services presentation. And the question was how to measure trade and services performance by country. Is it by mode classification?
I talked on yesterday about the index called the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, which is an index produced by the World Bank and the OECD that attempts to measure the restrictiveness of a country's policies, and the restrictiveness can be measured for the country as a whole. It can be measured for individual sectors, or it can be even measured for individual subsectors. So the measurement for a sector would be a combination of the measure for all the subsectors of that sector. The measure for an economy would be for all the sectors in the economy. And basically, it's a very detailed analysis that looks at how the services sectors are concerned are being restricted, how strong is the restrictiveness, and there are ways of assigning a value to the restrictiveness, and how important are the sectors, or how important are the restrictions, and that goes, all that information, which requires a lot of expert analysis and inevitably involves a certain amount of judgment by the experts making the index. All that information goes into the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, which ranks the restrictiveness on a scale from 0 to 1, or from 0 to 100 in some versions, where if the reading of restrictiveness is 0, it means that the sector concerned is completely open, there are no restrictions. And if the reading is 100, then the restrictiveness is complete. The sector is completely blocked from trade. So the higher the index reading, the more restrictive are the policies towards that sector. The lower the service restrictiveness index reading, closer to 0, the more open that sector is. I hope that makes sense. All right. Okay, so just as a final point, obviously, because of the relatively unsatisfactory results from existing methods of liberalisation, there have been efforts to try other methods. And one of them that's worth considering, partly because it also illustrates ways in which governments can cooperate in terms of freeing up trade, is the APEC Services Competitiveness Roadmap. Now, APEC, as we'll see in the lecture on trade agreements, is not actually a trade agreement in the sense that countries make binding commitments, legal commitments. It's a process where countries get together and reach agreement on policies and make commitments, but not binding commitments, not legally binding commitments, to implement those policies. And there is a lot of cooperative work that goes on within APEC to understand exactly how trade restrictions are operating in different economies, and what the effects are of different types of restriction, what economies have found works as a policy approach to freeing up the sectors, and so on like that. So there's a lot of consultation, a lot of capacity building goes on in APEC. And so the APEC Services Competitiveness Roadmap does not involve a trade agreement. It involves a whole range of what we call capacity building programs, building up understanding and knowledge, and actions which each member economy commits itself to take, but not in a legally binding way, which aims at enhancing the service sector competitiveness, make them more competitive. And that's really the whole point of freeing up services trade, is to increase competitiveness. So, and the different actions that they can take fall into the categories of promoting good regulatory practice, international regulatory cooperation, and also sound competition policy frameworks, because the more competition there is in a sector, the more open and the more efficient it's likely to be. Having service markets more open, which is a general target, objective, making sure that there's an adequate supply of skills, even though the economy might be changing rapidly, which means that there will always be enough people available to provide the workforce skills that are needed as the economy changes, and also facilitating effective and inclusive financial markets, which means that there are not too many barriers on companies, whether they're big or small, to getting access to finance for their operations, which means that efficient startup companies or smaller operators shouldn't face financial barriers to their progress. So those are the kind of things that can be applied in the service sector to make it more competitive. And there are a range of programs in the APEC Service Competitive Roadmap that the members have agreed to take without actually being legally bound to them. They haven't made any legal agreement. They've just committed themselves to do it without. There's no punishment if they don't. And that's very often that's the basic approach in APEC, is to reach agreement on what to do about whatever set of actions you're discussing, but not necessarily or not imposing any penalty for non-performance. And how do we know that's working? Well, the APEC members set a range of indicators which they agreed would indicate the progress that would be made in freeing up services trade. For example, just one example, the share of services in exports relative to the world average. If you were genuinely making the service sector more competitive and more open to trade, you would expect the share of services and exports to increase relative to the world average. So you look at that, and these indicators are reviewed on a periodic basis. And to be honest, the first reviews weren't all that spectacular. That didn't show much change in the indicators, but I think the more recent indicators have started to show more progress. In other words, there is some movement among the APEC economies to make their services sectors more competitive and therefore more open to trade. Now, just going beyond that, two very, very well-known services trade experts, Bernard Hoekman and Aditya Matu, some of them they may have worked in some of your economies, said, well, they think that the problem with an important part of the problem is that governments are not certain about what the regulatory reforms are required, that it is actually politically safe for them to do that, because there will be a lot of opposition to some of the reforms that are necessary, and that will be particularly hard to defend if the economic benefits can't really be demonstrated. So you need to be able to. The governments want to know that what they're going to do is not going to have them voted out of power, and as part of that, they want to be sure that the economic benefits are going to be such that the community as a whole will end up accepting the commitments that they've made or the changes that they've made. And so Hoekman and Matu suggest something they call regulatory cooperation, which brings the exporting and importing economies together to first of all build up a knowledge community to understand what's been done in different economies, to see what sector-specific regulatory policies are being implemented, sharing the experiences, what's worked, what hasn't worked, why didn't it work, what are the best practice, and bringing together in this work program the regulators and the experts, as well as the trade officials and the stakeholders, the companies that have an interest in it, to build up an understanding of what's involved, which they suggest if you do that, then governments to actually proceed with the regulatory reforms, by the time you've built up the necessary level of understanding within the people that need to understand, governments will be much more politically confident to go ahead with the reforms. That's a very long-winded explanation, but I mean that's actually a very good illustration of what actually happens in APEC in many fields. And then the other approach that we've seen also, as I talked about the WTO plurilateral initiatives last week, and one of them is on domestic services regulation, and this is bringing together WTO members who wanted to make some progress on services, even though no progress could be made at the level of the full WTO membership. And they worked on this over a period of time, and they reached agreement among 72 members, that's almost half the WTO membership, at disciplines that, if they were implemented, would mitigate any unintended trade restrictive effects of measures that related to licensing requirements and procedures, or qualification requirements and procedures, and technical standards. So trying to eliminate trade restrictive effects, that unintentional trade restrictive effects on a whole range of policy areas. And they managed to reach agreement on that. 72 members reached agreement on that in 2001. 2010 that should be, because it was launched in 2017. And these disciplines were actually the members who had reached this agreement, or 50 of those members actually implemented those disciplines in February last year, and they agreed that those would be automatically included in their GATS commitments, and that they would also be applied on an MFN basis. In other words, whatever benefits flowed to other WTO members from what each country was doing, those benefits would be available to all WTO members, whether they were part of this initiative or not. So again, that's an illustration of what can be done among governments that have a will to make progress, and in this case, how you can actually make progress on the WTO, even though not much progress can be made at the level of the full membership. Okay, so that brings me to an end of my material on services. It's probably not sufficient, but that's the best I can do in the time available. And we have a breakout session now planned where you'll look at a breakout topic, and the idea of this breakout topic is really just to let you share with each other what your experiences in your countries are regarding services trade liberalisation, what sort of issues arise regarding regulations, the amount of consultation among government departments that's needed. In other words, what are the challenges? Because liberalising services trade is challenging. So I'm sort of inviting you to share your experiences with each other about the challenges that you've experienced in your own countries in whatever services trade negotiations you've been involved in. So can we do that, Gay?
Yes.
Hello.
I have the breakout rooms ready to go, and then I'll share the question to the breakout rooms.
Okay, so as usual, we'll perhaps give 15 minutes for the discussion in the breakout rooms, and then 15 minutes for reporting back.
Yep, sounds good.
Okay.
Okay, I'm opening the rooms.
For those of you, are you having problems joining your room?
Which actually we in ASEAN are facing the same challenge, which is like capacity to access regulatory change, which is like we Malaysian, Laos, Cambodia, Indonesia also try to evaluating the potential impact for the service trade liberalization, which is required the robust all the net analytical capabilities, and then like Malaysia has undertaken initiative to enhance this capacity on this area, like we engage in a few studies to assess how the affected to the trade liberalization on various sector, like under my custom as well. And like my friend from Indonesia, which is she shared that they also have a uncertainty things happen, which is we have inefficiencies and differing priorities among agencies, which is they show the slowdown decision making and policy implementation. Besides that, our friend from the Cambodia and I think Vietnam also facing the same thing, which is we have a pressure from the business interest and political group, which is we have when the which is local company business and the multinational business coming. So we need to have a balancing of interest with the domestic industries and then what we can get from the multinational industries as well. So including business association and political group, which is we understand their concerns and then incorporate their perspective, which is in the follow the negotiation process. And then this is a participatory approach, which is aimed to line the trade policies, which is follow the national interest and economic goals. But yeah, Asian facing the same, which is we try to integrate it also the system integrated and try to follow the digital aiming nowadays. Yeah, that's it from our group one.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. That was a very, very clear, excellent explanation. Thank you. Can we move on to group two?
Yes, again, good afternoon, everybody, and good morning as well. So I represent Group 2. The come up discussion, the answer that we got by the challenge in service trade is also agreed among our team. It's like our team are from Vietnam, Philippines, Cambodia, and the Mary, where are you from? I'm sorry, I forgot to answer where. Philippines. Oh, yes. Okay. So the answer to the question of the challenge in service trade, we are facing the same problem. It's like the first point is about the regulatory complexity. Like we have a little bit bureaucratic hierarchy. So as a result, it's come with the inconsistent enforcement of the rule. And the second challenge we face so far is the skill gap. It's like in Cambodia, particularly, we are shortage of skilled labor in sector like IT, healthcare, and in finance or fintechs. And the third challenge we face is the infrastructure limitations. So like Vietnam and Cambodia, there are many places at rural area, there's no digital infrastructure. So this is what happened. And then rural area cannot connect to the Wi-Fi or network so far. So it's not going on much for trade in service in rural area. And that the other point when mentioned by our friends from Vietnam is the coordination, the difficult of the coordination amongst the government department. It's like there are many departments have to work together to build up the regulation related to trade in service. So this is the coordination sometimes is come up with very difficult. So the first group mentioned. So the result, the policy is not in place in times. So that's it. So if other want to add, please add on.
Well, thank you again. That was also very, very clear and very well presented. Thank you. I think you obviously have a very good understanding of all the problems. Can we move on to group 3?
Good morning, everyone. I am presenting the group 3, consists of Indonesia and Cambodia or Laos. So we identified the two biggest things that hinder the trade in services negotiation. The first is weak coordination among government agency and also the private sector, because in Indonesia, especially the multiple agency, including the central bank and also Ministry of Trade, have overlapping responsibility, leading to slow decision making in services trade negotiation. And we also have still lack of unified policy direction, which is makes it harder or to negotiate for our clear commitment in FTAs. So to tackle this kind of coordination, the government should have or create some initiative to improve the coordination. For example, like regulate the public-private dialogues or create a trade in services committee between the government and also the private sector to bridge gaps between the regulatory bodies and businesses. And also, we have to create a task force under the Ministry of Coordinating of Economic to unify position across agency. And then the second things that hinder the TIS negotiation is about the limited capacity to, assess regulatory framework changes. For example, because our country service sector is highly regulated with multiple ministry overseeing different industries, so it will creating a complicated of regulatory fragmentation. And then also the technical capacity gaps make it difficult to assess the impact of trade liberalization for domestic businesses and also the employment and competitiveness. And also the private sector will have some concern, to worry about the foreign competition without clear regulatory safeguards. So I think that's the two biggest thing that hinder the TIS negotiation. Maybe the one from additional for our college from group 3, please.
Okay, well, thank you again. That's a very clear picture I think we're getting from these reports of the issues that I think all of your economies are facing, and there's a lot of common ground there that we're seeing, and the problems and the issues are pretty well known, I think, and also some of the things that your governments are doing to address these issues are coming through as well. Okay, so finally, Group 4.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dương from Vietnam. So now I will talk about I think I see there are three countries added the information: Vietnam, Philippines, and Indonesia. So I will provide the information on Vietnam. Vietnam faces several key challenges in services trade negotiation. First one is coordination issues. Many ministry and agencies are involved, but communication between them isn't always smooth, leading to inconsistent policies. Pressure from business and political groups. Some industries like banking or telecom worry about losing their market share, while labor groups fear job losses, making third is some domestic service providers resist liberalization due to fears of increased competition from foreign firms. Uncertainty about liberalization, unlike good trade, the effects of open up service markets are harder to predict, so government tends to be cautious. Handling these challenges, Vietnam have partnering with international organization for training and technical support, strengthening interagency collaboration to align strategies, often off steps by step, priority strong sectors while protecting sensitive ones, consulting business and experts to ensure fair policies. While Vietnam faced significant challenges in service trade negotiation, it has taken proactive steps to address them through strengthening institution capacity, enhancing interagency coordination, supporting domestic business and SMEs, implementing safeguards for sensitive sectors, participating in gradual and flexible trade liberalization. These strategies help Vietnam balance economic growth, regulation adaptation, and national interests, ensuring that service trade liberalization benefits the economies while minimizing risks. And for Indo, what is the partner from Indo? In section 4. Excuse me?
Okay. Are you asking your colleagues from Indonesia to share as well? Dong?
Yeah.
Okay. So anybody from the group from Indonesia who'd like to add to what Dong has already explained? I think we have Tegar to add something.
Okay. From Indonesia, to challenge, especially for public service agency in Indonesia. One challenge is competition with American service providers due to service trade liberalization. Through trade agreements such as the ASEAN Framework Agreement on Service and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, Indonesia is committed to opening specific service sectors, including healthcare and education, to foreign investors. Public service agency in the healthcare sector and the education sector face competition from foreign services provider who often have superior capital, technology, and international without adequate preparedness. Service liberalization may cause public service agency to lose competitiveness, especially in attracting patients or students who may prefer foreign institution. Number two, uh, regu- regu- regulatory constraint and the need for flexibility to adapt to global changes. Trade policies for grant global service provided access to the Indonesian market require public service agency to more flexible in financial management to adapt to market shifts. However, public service agencies still face bureaucratic and regulatory constraints that limit their ability to innovate and operate efficiently. For instance, public service agencies in partnership with private service providers or investment to enhance their competitiveness often encounter difficulties due to the rigid financial regulation, procurement processes, and administrative practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was a very comprehensive set of comments. Thank you. I think Suzanne Orgay said there was a question in the chat which also relates to this topic as well. Is that, do we have that?
Yes. So it was a question around the idea that countries that are still growing their economies should focus on trade in goods, and this idea that trade in services is only possible if the economy is quite mature and developed. So the question was, is this because services liberalization is difficult?
Well, it's certainly true that services liberalisation is difficult, but I don't think it's necessarily a matter of the size of the country. It's more a question of what are the issues that are being faced and what are the implications for different parts of the community, and what is the capacity of the country, what are the specific issues, what specifically can be done about the issues that exist in the country concerned. I'll just give you an example, only an illustrative example from Pacific Island countries, which are probably some of the smallest countries in the world. And in terms of mobile phone technology, many years ago when mobile phone technology was first introduced, in a number of Pacific Island countries, there was a single monopoly provider of mobile phone services, which was usually a multinational, a British multinational called Cable and Wireless in many countries. And as you'd expect, the prices were very high, both for the connection and also for the mobile phone themselves. And people in the countries concerned didn't really have good access to all the benefits of mobile phone technology. When the decision was taken to allow other providers to enter, then, as you would expect, there was a dramatic fall in the price of mobile phones and also in the connection charges. And so mobile phone technology spread much more widely in a number of Pacific Island countries. And what that meant was that more and more farmers, for example, in outlying areas could get information on the prices in the town markets for their crops and decide how to harvest their crops or when to harvest them, when to get the best price. Many people found that they could get access to mobile banking when they couldn't have actually got access to banking at the physical locations of the bank. So that that was just one example. And of course, not every country is like that. There are also cases where the service was being provided by the government and or a government company, and in some cases this would be the government using this as an easy source of revenue. But did the government really need to monopolise that sector in order to get the revenue from it? So I think what I would really say is not so much the size of the country or the level of development. It's more a question of the facts on the ground. in each case that will determine the course of action that maybe can or should be taken in terms of services, opening up services trade. Obviously, there'll be limitations in how much a small country can do, but also I'd suggest that in a very large country, that can introduce complexities that also can be very hard to deal with. And I think we heard some of those in some of the feedback from the breakout group. So, yeah, I don't think it's necessarily purely a matter of smallness or level of development. It's what is the particular service that's being provided? What are the implications of how it's being provided? How could that be done better if there was more competition? And those kind of issues can be the decision factors, or should be the decision factors. Okay, so I think we might move on, shall we, to
Yes.
talk about preferential trade agreements. So I'll start sharing my screen again. Okay, so we'll go back to the current slide. Okay. Right, go to here. Current slide. Okay, so for the rest of the session, I'm going to be talking about what I've called here regional trade agreements, sometimes called free trade agreements, although, as we'll see, FTAs or free trade agreements are not the only type of regional trade agreement, and not all agreements are regional. But the common factor to all of these types of agreements is that they are all preferential, in the sense that the members of these agreements are agreeing to treat their members better than they treat other countries. So that's the preference that is involved in all of these types of agreements. So the more general term actually is preferential trade agreements. But anyway, I'll talk about some of the economics involved. I'll talk about some of the issues that are common to all of these agreements, and then I'll quickly talk a little bit about the developments in ASEAN and the Asia Pacific, and finishing up, hopefully, if there's time, to talk quite a lot about the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Okay, so first of all, in terms of what kinds of agreements we have and how they work, and we can start with, first of all, just a preferential agreement where barriers on trade between members are reduced but not removed. And we have quite a lot of examples of these. We've had quite a lot of examples of these among developing countries. The point to look at in this graph is what is happening to the way that countries A and B within the agreement treat the imports from country C. You can say that's the outside world, compared to how they treat each other. And here we can see that country A is imposing a tariff of 5% on the imports from country B. A 10% tariff is imposed by country B on the imports from country A, and each of them impose higher barriers on imports from country C, the outside world. So 10% in country A compared to 5% that is applied to country B, and 20% from country B on imports from country C compared to only 10% from its partner country A. So the countries are giving each other, A and B are giving each other a preference in terms of tariff treatment over the treatment of countries outside the agreement. And now, we do have rules in the WTO, which are basically an original GATT article, which I'm sure most of you know about, GATT Article 24, which, although some of these rules and GATT articles and even WTO are starting to slip in terms of the extent that countries follow them, a lot of agreements are still designed to comply with GATT Article 24. And GATT Article 24 doesn't allow this kind of agreement, because it's not eliminating the barriers completely, and it's not treating each party equally. So what Article 24 requires is the elimination of trade barriers between members on substantially all the trade within a reasonable period of time. So the tariffs that A and B impose on each other should go down to zero on a large part of their trade. And of course, what does substantially all the trade mean and a reasonable period of time? An understanding has been built up within the WTO that substantially all trade means 90% of all trade in value terms, and a reasonable period of time is generally understood to be 10 years, although that's not an absolute requirement or rule. And although the GATT Article 24 doesn't allow these types of preferential agreement where there is no complete elimination on the trade between the two parties, in actual fact, there have been dispensations introduced for developing countries, particularly in the 1970s, and when the developing countries were insisting on some special recognition in trade rules of their particular issues and their particular challenges. Something called the enabling clause and also GATT Part 4, which did allow this kind of arrangement when it was only between developing countries. There was no developed country involved. So, but the more common and perhaps the most common type of preferential agreement, I'm sure as you know, is the Free Trade Area or FTA, where the members involved remove all the trade barriers between each other. So zero tariffs on country A imports from country B and from country B imports from country A, but keeping their separate trade barriers on imports from country C, 10% by country A and 20% on country C's exports by country B. This actually could meet the requirement of the GATT rules, provided that this was done for substantially all trade and that the barriers went to zero between the two parties within a reasonable period of time. And it's also a requirement that the barriers on the outside world, in other words, in this case from country C, mustn't be increased when the free trade agreement is implemented. Now, the practical consequence of these special arrangements for developing countries is that these provisions like GATT Part 4 and enabling clause allow these partial preferences to be given by not only between developing economies, but also by developed countries can give one-way partial preferences to all developing countries considered as a group, provided they the understanding is they should do this for all developing countries. So you have the generalized system of preferences, which several developed countries have, which in principle should apply to all developing countries, although, for example, the United States reserves the right to withhold the benefits of the GSP from countries that it deems have unsatisfactory labour policies or human rights policies. The European Union has everything but arms, EBA, for least developed countries. The United States, again, also has an agreement for most of the African countries called the African Growth and Opportunities Act, African Growth and Economic Opportunities Act, or AGOA, and also the Caribbean Basin Initiative, again from the United States, for 17 Caribbean states. It's also worth noting that these exceptions apply only to trade in goods. There is no enabling clause for services. The full rules of the WTO on trade agreements have to apply to agreements that involve trade and services. So if we look at what the developing countries have in the way of trade agreements with developing countries, they're quite significant. European Union has its economic partnership agreements, all designed to be WTO compatible, to be compatible with the WTO rules and replace previous WTO rule free trade arrangements that weren't compatible. And this involves having these EPAs with 7 separate regions: Central Africa, East and Southern Africa, East African Community, South African Development Community, the West African Group, and the Caribbean and Pacific groups. The United States also has 15 developing FTAs with 15 developing countries in Latin America and the Middle East. Sorry, I've gone. I actually missed out some slides here. We go beyond, of course. Sorry. We should have also looked at the case of the customs union, which is where countries do remove all the barriers between themselves as they would in a free trade agreement in this example, but they also harmonise their tariffs on imports from the outside world, from country C here. So in this example, countries A and B have harmonised their tariff, common external tariff on the outside world as 15%. And again, there are WTO rules, and in this case, as well as the substantially all trade and reasonable period of time requirement, the common external tariff has to be, on average, no higher than the pre-union tariff on the outside world. Common market, which we know of as the single market in the European Union, must have a free trade agreement or a customs union at its base, because those are the structures that are legitimised by WTO rules, but they go beyond this to have free movement. The common market goes beyond this to have free movement of labour and capital between the members. It may also have free trade and services if that hasn't already been agreed. And of course, the European Union is the most complete example, but I've given you a number of examples from developing countries where efforts have been made to establish a common market. And if we go beyond the common markets to the economic union, again, the European Union as an example, coordination of monetary, fiscal and welfare policy, which means common currency in the limit, in the extreme limit. That's the highest level of monetary union. And again, the European Union, most advanced example, but we also have customs unions, currency unions, and attempted economic unions in various parts of the developing world, in the Caribbean, in West Africa, in Central Africa, in Southern Africa, and East Africa, but not, of course, in Asia. Some people say that the amount of common policies that have to be adopted in an economic union will inevitably lead to political union, and that was once thought to be the eventual outcome for the European Union. The European Union has moved towards that outcome, but with the European Parliament, but certainly no union into a single political unit, as like a single country like the United States. And that's another graph showing the different characteristics of each type of preferential trade arrangement in a different format. Let me now talk about what we know from economics about the economic effects of preferential trade agreements. So our standard trade theory tells us that freeing up trade at the unilateral level, one country removing its trade barriers, that means, or multilateral trade liberalisation, many countries getting together to remove their trade barriers against each other. Under a range of assumptions, the effects of these types of trade liberalisation are unambiguously positive on the welfare of the liberalising countries and also on global welfare. In other words, these types of liberalisation are positive both for the countries themselves and all for the world as a whole. So can we go from that to say that the welfare effects of preferential agreements are also unambiguously positive, that they will unambiguously benefit the countries concerned? And the answer is possibly, but not necessarily. It really depends on the facts of the case, and this is an example of the theory of the second best, which some of you may be familiar from your economic studies, and which actually developed out of analyses that were made in 1950 on the economic effects of customs unions. Sorry, this my computer is jumping from slide to slide. I'm sorry about this. I'll try to control it. And the issue that we have to be aware of in looking at the effects of a preferential trade agreement is the two different effects of trade creation and trade diversion. So if we have industries where the partner countries are internationally competitive and they remove trade barriers on imports from each other, that is unambiguously welfare enhancing, making those countries better off unambiguously, and we call that pure trade creation. But there will often be cases where the preferential agreement occurs where a partner country, or both countries maybe, are not internationally competitive. In this case, there are going to be two effects. One of them is going to be trade creation, which involves removal of barriers between countries on products where the partners are internationally competitive, and trade diversion, which is welfare reducing, where the removal of trade barriers between the partners mean that the partners, one or more of the partners, starts to import goods from the partner country when the non-member countries that are being excluded by that are actually more competitive and offer the product at a lower price. I'll give you an example of that from Australia and New Zealand to make it easier. Australia and New Zealand now have a very successful and very effective trade agreement called the ANCERTA agreement, but it wasn't always like that. From the 1930s through to the mid-1980s, both countries had very high levels of protection to protect their manufacturing industries in particular. And in the first free trade agreement between Australia and New Zealand happened in the 1960s, called the New Zealand-Australia Trade Agreement. It was free trade agreement, which was actually, the acronym for that was NAFTA, curiously enough. And what was happening as a result of that was that the two countries were opening their markets by removing the trade barriers on their manufactured goods, where their manufactured goods were very inefficient internationally, in a national sense, because the manufacturing industries in Australia and New Zealand were so highly protected. And that meant, of course, they were high-cost producers, and opening up free trade, removing the trade barriers on the imports of those inefficient manufacturers from Australia and New Zealand, led to the Australian and New Zealand products replacing the much more efficient and lower cost imports from countries outside the free trade area. That's trade diversion. So in other words, both of us were actually selling products to each other under the trade agreement, and these products were entering the markets when those products, free of charge, when those products could have been obtained by each country at a much lower price from much more competitive producers, for example, in Asia. And that was trade diversion. And there's no doubt that the early free trade arrangement between Australia and New Zealand was significantly trade diverting. And the trade diversion is welfare producing because we're shifting from a lower cost supplier to a higher cost supplier country, purely because we've removed the tariffs on imports from the higher cost supplier, but not from the lower cost supplier. And so the general conclusion from this is that there may well be some elements of trade creation and trade diversion in most trade agreements, but if the trade creation dominates trade diversion, if the agreement is predominantly a trade creating agreement, then welfare increases. If trade diversion dominates trade creation, if it's primarily a trade diverting agreement, then the countries involved are going to be worse off. And that was probably almost certainly the case with Australia and New Zealand, until they changed their trade policies in the 1980s, lowered their trade barriers very, very substantially, and negotiated a new agreement called the ANZFTA, Australia-New Zealand Free Closer Economic Relations Agreement, and CETA, I should have said, which is a much more welfare enhancing agreement. It's a trade creating agreement, whereas the previous agreement was certainly a trade diverting agreement to a large extent. Particularly because they tended to exclude the products from the agreement that each of them were more competitive in the old agreement. So the next point to make about trade agreements is perhaps one of the most important points about trade agreements is rules of origin. If you are having an agreement which is applying only to imports from your partner country, you need to be sure that when your imports come from the partner country, we only apply the preferences, the zero tariffs, which eventually will apply in a free trade agreement, they only get applied to the partner countries. Now, that would seem obvious if the products are being completely produced in the partner countries, but very often the products being exported, and most products, in fact, generally, will include materials and components and other inputs from other countries. And so the question that emerges from that is that you want the countries engaged in the free trade agreement want to be sure that the benefits of the market access they're giving to their partners are mainly being concentrated on the partner and not on some kind of backdoor way of products from other countries entering your market by being incorporated into the production of the partner country. But of course, most products that are going to be traded will be only partly the product of the partner country and will include some imports that have come from non-partner countries. And the question is, how do you actually determine, how do you devise a rule that allows you to import, to say that you're, or to identify which products should be subject to the preferences. And as I'm sure you know, you can have either an area content rule or the regional value content, the percent of the value of the product that has to be attributed to the manufacturer in the partner country. For example, in the New Zealand-Singapore agreement, it's 40% of products produced in New Zealand or exported from New Zealand or Singapore has to consist of content created in New Zealand or Singapore. And the other option, which has become much more popular, is the change in tariff classification. All products have being traded have a tariff classification, and the change in tariff classification is based on specifying a difference in the customs classification between imported inputs and the finished good, such that provided the difference is sufficient, then that would be treated as qualifying for the preference. It's now the issue the apparent issue there is that these rules can look extremely complex because the tariff, most products being produced in say Australia and New Zealand could be include quite a large range of products imported from other countries, all with different tariff classifications, and to set up a change in tariff classification rule, and you will have to have a very extensive publication of tariffs, because the situation will be different for every product, and so you will need you can have a very, very extensive list of CTC rules for different products, sometimes running to hundreds of pages. But the benefit of this is that the manufacturers in each country, they know exactly what the tariff classification is of the products that they will produce and export to the partner country. So it's very easy for them to know whether in fact they're complying with the CTC or change in tariff classification rule. And this idea is extended in many new agreements to have actually product-specific rules, where the CT rules applying to individual products are specified separately, so that you have so that the manufacturers of each product category know exactly what they can and cannot include in their product to comply, if they want to comply with the rules of origin. You can also have things like a specific process involved, like the United States has something called the yarn forward rule, which actually says that if you're exporting clothing to the United States under a free trade agreement, the United States will typically require that not only the article of clothing was produced in your country, but they will also require that the yarn from which it was produced either in your country or in the United States, and the cloth that was produced from the yarn and that was used to produce the clothing item was also produced either in your country or the United States. And that, of course, prevents clothing countries with very competitive clothing industries, or who would like to perhaps use cloth from very competitive cloth producers like Bangladesh or something like that. That makes it difficult for them to source the least cost inputs for their clothing manufacture. It also is a kind of protection for cloth and yarn manufacturers in the United States, because one way of satisfying the rule is to produce your clothing from cloth that has been produced in the United States, which may or may not have been produced in the United States or might have been somewhere else. Now, in some trade agreements and in some of the ASEAN agreements, I believe, we have what are called co-equal rules of origin, where the exporting country has the option of demonstrating eligibility under either the value content rule or the change in tariff classification (CTC) rules. They can choose which one is going to apply. But in all of these cases, the exporter will be required to produce a certificate that it is actually meeting the rule of origin. And that the rules for producing these certificates also can vary, because some countries will require a certificate to be produced by some kind of independent body, like a Chamber of Commerce. May involve the need for inspection of the manufacturing facilities of the exporter. But in many cases now we find we have a self-certification where the exporter, exporters themselves certify that they have met the rules of origin on the product being sold to a partner country, taking the risk that if the partner country decided to investigate it and found that the rule of origin hadn't been complied with, then they might find themselves subject to some punitive action and probably having to pay the tariffs and backdated tariffs, and also maybe some kind of other penalty as well. So the importance of this is that rules of origin can have a huge effect on the impact of a free trade agreement or any preferential agreement. They can in fact be more important than market access. For market access than the removal of tariffs. You can have tariffs removed, but the rules of origin are still too difficult for the export country to meet, partly because complying with the rules of origin imposes costs, increases the cost of exporting. You have to be able to show that you've met the rule, and it involves having accounting systems and documentation that allows you to demonstrate that. You may have to change the production process to change where you source your inputs from, and you may have to use some more expensive inputs from a partner country, for example. And the certification requirement may be or may not be very burdensome. I mean, having your factory inspected is obviously quite burdensome. Having self-certification is much less burdensome, although it does have a risk attached to it. And if these costs of meeting the rules of origin are too high, in other words, if they exceed the benefit of the tariff reduction under the free trade agreement, then of course no trade will take place. So restrictive rules of origin can undermine or even cancel out the trade liberalisation that might take place under the free trade agreement. There's also an important point, which is actually very important for ASEAN, is accumulation. If you're a group of countries like the ASEAN countries that are producing goods for export using inputs from each other through the trade arrangements among ASEAN countries, for example, ideally you want the inputs from all of the ASEAN countries to be counted towards satisfying the rule of origin. In other words, if it was a value added rule, you would add up all of the value added from all of the ASEAN countries in a product that might be exported finally, say, by Indonesia or by Thailand or by Vietnam. And that's called accumulation. So if you have an integrated group of countries that are where the production processes among themselves are very integrated, you really want also a provision for accumulation in the rules of origin in the rules of origin. There are various types of accumulation, which I won't go into, but it's probably a very important issue, or potentially a very important issue for ASEAN countries because of the extent of integration of production across the ASEAN countries. They are a very important issue in the negotiation of free trade agreements. Industries that are threatened by the free trade agreement if they realise that the government is politically committed to the free trade agreement, for example, they may feel, well, they've got no possibility of changing that. So what they may do is divert from fighting against the agreement itself to fighting for more restrictive rules of origin, because if they can persuade their government to agree to insist on very restrictive rules of origin, that will protect them perhaps as much as a tariff. So whereas the companies that are exporting within the free trade agreement obviously want much more favourable rules of origin, much more permissive rules of origin, and likewise the companies that are operating global value chains want the rules of origin to be as flexible as possible. So it's a very big issue in the negotiation of any free trade agreement. I talked about the question of the rules of origin in the United States, the yarn forward rule, which provides some actually protection by the by for US cloth and yarn producers. And that was very important going back to the TPP agreement when the United States was involved. I think the United States and Vietnam had some very tough negotiations about what the rules of origin would be for clothing and textiles for the TPP. Of course, they became irrelevant once the United States withdrew from the TPP, which in turn deprived Vietnam from some of the biggest benefits that Vietnam expected to get from the TPP. I'm showing you these next 3-4 slides, just repeating them from my first session, just to emphasize that one of the things that has tended to expand the use of preferential trading agreements, free trade agreements, customs unions, etc., has been that there have been so many new developments in international trade that the WTO has not been able to keep up with, in particular the emphasis on what we call behind the border issues that relate to the operation of global value chains, the digital economy issues, and more and more we're finding that it's where that preferential trade agreements are where these issues are more easily addressed, and so that does tend to encourage firms to some extent to maybe prioritize or maybe look for more free trade agreements, particularly where the free trade agreements can include provisions that are beneficial to their export industries where the relevant provisions don't exist in the WTO. So I'll just you've had these slides in the first session, but I'm just repeating that. And of course, we do see that preferential trade agreements, not just on a bilateral basis, but very large preferential trading agreements, have become more and more prevalent in the international trading system.
So do you think we should have a break, Rob?
Yeah, I was just looking to see what the time is to see whether that would be a
10
good
to 4.
coffee break. So maybe a 15-minute coffee break.
Yep, that sounds good.
Yeah.
So, and perhaps, I mean, obviously you should go and get a coffee and stretch your legs, Rob, but also there's a few questions in the chat that you might want to have a look at and maybe type some answers in.
Okay, sure. I'll have a look at that. I'll get a cup of coffee and then I'll have a look at those.
Perfect.
Sure.
All right, everyone, we'll see you in 15 minutes.
Thank you, President Susan. Yes, see you.
All right. Okay, well, welcome back. And we now move to look at what has been actually happening to trade agreements in the Asia-Pacific region and look at both ASEAN and the Asia-Pacific as a whole. You'll see that the slides do cover most of the developments that ASEAN has been involved in. I will possibly run a little bit quickly over some of this because I expect that you are very familiar with what ASEAN has been doing and probably know more about it than me. But I did want to include the material on ASEAN, but to make clear that ASEAN has been a very important part of all of these developments. So forgive me if I skip a little bit quickly over the ASEAN aspects, but also I will try to make clear just how important a role that ASEAN has been playing in these Asia-Pacific developments. Okay, so sorry, I'm trying to get my computer to behave. Okay, so I put here for your reference a timeline on some of the main developments in economic integration in the Asia-Pacific region.
Sorry, Rob. Can you share your slides?
Oh. Sorry. Okay, did I not do that? Okay, so let me. Where can I do that? Oh.
Rob, do you know you're on mute?
We can see your slides now, Rob. It's just we can't see you and we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. Sorry again, folks. Okay, so the story really starts at the end of the old Cold War, when there was a need seen in the Asia-Pacific region in particular for new geopolitical and economic alignments, and more recognised that the Asia-Pacific countries were both in practice and potentially very closely related by trade. At the same time, there was the concern to support the GATT Uruguay round as it was then, and the multilateral trade negotiations. And those sort of factors led to the establishment of APEC, which we all know in 1989. The membership there was the original membership. Southeast Asian nations and ASEAN thought hard about whether to support this. They were worried about being bullied, I suppose you could say, within APEC. And there was a Kuching consensus, under which they decided the terms on which they would join APEC. And the main ones were that they insisted that all commitments made within APEC should be voluntary and non-binding, which is a aspect of the APEC process that remains until today. So very, very important stipulation. And also that APEC would pay due emphasis to development cooperation, which is in APEC speak as ecotech. We had China, Hong Kong and Chinese Taipei joining as individual members of APEC in 1991. I think the first time that those three entities had been separately admitted to a single international organization. So we call in APEC because of that, we call China, China, we call Hong Kong, China, and we call Taiwan Chinese Taipei. And that convention has remained in place to the present day. APEC spent a few years deciding what its agenda would be, and it wanted to focus a lot on trade, freeing trade and investment in the Asia-Pacific region, and that led to the so-called Bogor goals, agreed at the APEC leaders meeting in Bogor in Indonesia, which was to achieve free trade and investment in the Asia-Pacific by 2010 in the case of developed economies and 2020 for developing economies. And then a more interesting aspect of that was that it was the intention was to achieve this on a non-preferential basis. So APEC was not going to be a preferential trade agreement, offering preferences to where the members offered preferences to each other. It was to be support. It was supposed to liberalize by unilateral liberalization effectively against all imports, but done by all of the APEC members, what we called concerted unilateralism. And this was seen at the time very enthusiastically as a solution to the debate that was going on in economic policy and economic theory as well, between regionalism and multilateralism. So the idea was, if we liberalize by simply reducing all our trade barriers on a MFN basis against all countries, that's what happens in the multilateral system. But if we all do it together, we're also integrating our region. So that was the idea behind this open regionalism or concerted unilateralism. And it was also seen as a way of supporting the multilateral trading system, which was just getting underway with the WTO, at the same time as promoting regional integration. You see this as trans-Pacific in character, the membership and the objectives. There's been a tension all the way through, or ever since the East Asian crisis, there's been a tension all the way through between a trans-Pacific approach and the East Asian approach, which we'll talk about briefly. So APEC had three pillars, which the agenda had three pillars, which it still has: trade and investment liberalization, business facilitation, which includes, of course, trade facilitation, and then this ecotech, or economic and technical cooperation, which was emphasized at the insistence of ASEAN. Now, I'll fast forward here to 2020 and say, well, obviously these objectives had not been fully achieved. There'd been substantial progress towards them, but they were still quite a long way from being fully achieved. And so APEC members had to decide in 2020, what do we do about that? And what they did in 2020 at the Malaysian APEC meetings was to commit themselves to these goals to be achieved in a longer time frame by 2040, along with a range of other elements of regional economic cooperation. So this was called the Putrajaya Vision 2040, which is now, if you like, the successor to the Bogor goals, and the declaration of support for the WTO and the multilateral trading system is also part of the Putrajaya vision. So you can see there that this is the way the APEC membership exposed. The green shaded members are the ones that were there in 1989. 1991, we see China, Taiwan and Hong Kong, Chinese Taipei and Hong Kong, China. 1993, we see Mexico included because recognizing the importance of the North American Free Trade Agreement and Mexico's part in that. And then 1994, we had more, another member, Chile, which was at that time expecting to join the NAFTA, but never did. And then finally, 1998, the final enlargement of APEC, Russia, which has caused endless problems in the modern period, Vietnam, we had Papua New Guinea there, I forgot to mention them in 1993, and also Peru. So that brings us up to 21 members of APEC. So how does APEC actually work? I'll quickly run through this and then we won't talk about APEC very much anymore. Basically, it's set itself up as a forum for regional economic cooperation, and it often likes to think of itself as an incubator of ideas, developing ideas that could promote cooperation regionally, economic cooperation regionally, and incubating them, developing them through internal consultation and research and analysis to the point where they could be brought out into the region as a whole. The voluntary non-binding modality remains at the heart of the process. That was basically one of the contributions of ASEAN to the setup of APEC. And APEC has a large number of working groups in line with its idea of a forum and an incubator of ideas on chosen issues where the members decide issues they want to work on with a view to encouraging regional cooperation on those issues and possibly including them in agreements outside Asia including them in agreements outside APEC, and where they also typically will try to set up capacity building programs in relation to these issues. And when they can reach agreement, they often express this in the form of a roadmap. So we have the APEC and Services Competitiveness Roadmap and implementation plans that I talked about at the end of the session on services. The APEC Internet and Digital Economy Roadmap. There's an APEC agenda for structural reform, which has been a very big part of APEC's agenda, based on the recognition that for countries, or we call them economies in Asia, in APEC, to actually comfortably liberalise, they need to have good policies domestically. And the structural reform agenda is really about policy change and policy reform within APEC members economies that will set themselves up for international integration. APEC privacy framework, a roadmap on combating IUU fishing, and there are various other agendas or roadmaps that APEC has led up to. Now, these are not formal agreements in the sense that the members have committed themselves in a binding or legal way, but they do represent a consensus on what is expected of APEC members by each other in terms of moving forward on these issues. So it does actually create a sense of cooperating around a sense of maybe loosely defined norms, but nevertheless norms which APEC members expect each other to follow. Now, ASEAN, this is where we can go perhaps a little bit more quickly because I'm sure you're very familiar with it. The ASEAN Free Trade Agreement after 1992, partly a reaction to APEC, and also the rise of China as a competitor for foreign direct investment. So that started the ASEAN trade process. You also had the ASEAN Regional Forum in 94. You had the expansion to include the CLMV countries, which brought in the issue of a development gap between the old ASEAN members and the new ones, and how to deal with that. And the recognition that as integration accelerated outside ASEAN, ASEAN would need to broaden and accelerate its own integration to keep up. So you get accelerated timetables, you get a framework agreement on services, you get the ASEAN investment area. Then we had this huge earthquake in the region called the Asian Economic Crisis in 97, 98, where the East Asia reacted saw themselves as being left out in the cold by the world economy and its institutions and left to fend for itself. That's an exaggeration, but they certainly did feel that the outside world hadn't really helped sufficiently, and that led to East Asian economies as a group resolving that they really need to do much more to support each other and to work together in cooperation there. So this led to the idea of East Asian regionalism as if you like, a parallel to Trans-Pacific cooperation. So you have these two themes running side by side from this point on. ASEAN very quickly asserted the principle of ASEAN centrality as one of the reactions, and it took several steps to support this, further accelerating AFTA, establishing the ASEAN Plus FTAs with 6 partners, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and India. Later on, there were proposals to make this to build this into a formal agreement, either based on the ASEAN Plus 3 group, which was China, Japan, Korea, or the ASEAN Plus 6 group that would also include India, Australia, and New Zealand. Another very important decision in 2003, again, to accelerate the integration within ASEAN, the ASEAN Economic Community, which was to be established on the original timetable by 2020, but as part of an overall ASEAN community that would include a socio-cultural community and a political and security community. So this is ASEAN building up stronger links among the members, not only in trade and economics, but in a wide range of other areas as well. Now, just to say briefly about the ASEAN Economic Community, there was a target date of 2007 brought forward to 2015, or delayed, I suppose we should say, to 2015 eventually. Some of the elements of the economic community that were envisaged were a single market and production base, obviously thinking in terms of, in some way, following the European Union single market, free movement of goods, investment, capital, and eventually even services, priority sectors, and making the region more economically competitive, and integrating into the global economy through the ASEAN Plus free trade agreements, and later on, of course, RCEP, and to some extent TPP. So looking for lower transaction costs, better infrastructure and logistics, reduced barriers to trade and investment, all the time recognizing the need to deepen the integration within ASEAN itself, making progress in AFTA by upgrading the AFAS, the ASEAN Free Trading and Services, to ASEAN Trade and Services Agreement, bridging the development gap between the original ASEAN 6 and the CLMV, and encouraging deeper economic reforms in the member economies. There was a famous blueprint in 2008, listing all the actions by ASEAN governments that they needed to take to create the ASEAN Economic Community. That's obviously modelled on the European Union's similar list of actions that they produced to implement the single European market. Huge number of actions, slightly dialed back eventually, but then also consolidating the instruments for trade in goods, investment, and trade in services. The AFTA agreement consolidated into ATIGA, the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement, the investment provisions consolidated into the ASEAN Comprehensive Investment Agreement, the Services Agreement, eventually upgraded to ATISA. There were scorecards established to measure progress on the blueprint, and an impressive number of measures were actually implemented by 2015. But some of the key areas, I guess you could say, for real progress were lagging behind: services, non-tariff barriers, logistics, border clearance, which are probably still, I guess, some of the lagging areas still today. So when the 2015 turned out to be a bit out of reach, there was a recognition that the ASEAN Economic Community had been established, but not realised, was the wording that was used, and a new blueprint for 2025 was issued. That's a timeline which I found online, which I'm sure you know about, and which may help you to visualise the changes that I've just described. And so we talk about the progress and the challenges. Impressive achievement on tariff elimination. See the figures there. The rules of origin have been simplified. There's been progress on trade and services, progress on trade facilitation, but there are still challenges remaining, as I'm sure you know. Policies on foreign direct investment still restricted in many ASEAN members. Non-tariff barriers remain extensive, and so there have been some increases to some extent. The single window has been a work in progress. There's limited action on mode 4, service supplied by people movement, although that's, I think, has certainly developed over time. And most of the so-called behind the border policies and regulations, which have been a focus in trade negotiations ever since we saw the rise of global value chains, these tend to operate still at the national rather than the regional level. And one of the puzzling things about ASEAN and the AEC is that despite all that has happened, the total share of ASEAN trade within ASEAN still remains quite low at 22%, and that percentage hasn't really increased in any dramatic way over all these years. And I don't know what the answer is to that, and I think it's probably been given a lot of attention within ASEAN itself as well. So that's the ASEAN story. And in the wider Asia-Pacific region, ASEAN was active there as well, as was East Asia as a whole. So 2002, from the first 12 years of the new century, this explosion, I suppose you could call, of FTAs, the Asia Pacific Noodle Bowl. That's a reference to the famous concept of the spaghetti bowl of FTAs that was popularized by Jagdish Bhagwati. The Asian version of that is the noodle bowl, because, of course, Asians eat noodles, not spaghetti. The 2010, the negotiations for a Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which was at that time led by the United States, or certainly seen as a US-led initiative, and I guess you could say it really was. The agreement was concluded in 2015, but then replaced in 2017 by the CPTPP after the US withdrew immediately after the election of President Trump. Trump won. It includes several ASEAN members: Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei, as well as Japan, but not Korea and not China. From 2014 and 16, there was a proposal within APEC for a free trade area, or it was taken forward within APEC for a free trade area of the Asia Pacific that would include all APEC members on both sides of the Pacific, which was intended to be built on the foundations of the TPP and RCEP, which I am coming to. And so on the East Asian side, a little bit later, we see than the TPP, we see in 2013 the launch of negotiations for the ASEAN-led Regional Comprehensive Partnership, RCEP, and that was very much, as you know, an ASEAN initiative. It was first of all agreed by ASEAN leaders in 2011. The decision to move to negotiations, again, taken by ASEAN leaders in 2012, and inviting any members of the ASEAN 6 group, of the +6 group who wanted to join, and also India. The negotiations began in 2013, concluded in 2021, and RCEP entered into force without India in 2022, India having decided at the last minute to opt out, which is quite a story in itself that we don't really have time for. And I guess the other initiative we should mention, although it's not clear what will happen to it under President Trump, the 2022 launch by the United States as an Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, with its 4 pillars, one pillar being trade, but made clear by the United States that would not involve access to the US market, supply chains, clean economy, and fair economy. Essentially trying to provide a venue in which the United States could continue to interact with all of the members of all of the East Asian countries, as well as India, on trade issues. So just some diagrams to actually just sort of summarize what I've just said. This is the sort of situation in the 1990s where you had a relatively orderly trade architecture, if you like. You have APEC there, you have the various trade agreements that were operating there and their memberships, and that looked pretty orderly up until the turn of the century, when you suddenly saw the explosion of free trade agreements and preferential agreements all around the Asia Pacific. So you get preferential trade being developed in all kinds of directions between the countries. No time to go into the individual ones, but you can see basically the idea of the noodle bowl or spaghetti bowl. This is another version of it that was produced by one of my friends in the Inter-American Development Bank. And then we move to the attempt to consolidate all these things, the RCEP, which has the membership of the members of ASEAN, plus Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, and China, and the CPTPP, which has the membership of a number of ASEAN members, plus Australia, New Zealand, of course, plus Japan, and also on the American side of the Pacific, Canada, Mexico, and Chile. And obviously the big missing element there is, of course, the United States, which is not a member of either RCEP or the CPTPP. So you then have this sort of a diagram of the Asia-Pacific architecture, which you might find helpful to sort of summarize things. You've got the APEC members in the blue circle, intersecting with the RCEP, all APEC members except Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, India being outside, of course. ASEAN and Korea, China and Japan, Australia and New Zealand having ASEAN Plus agreements, the Canada-US, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement on the other side of the Pacific, and the CPTPP, which links those countries with some of the Asian countries and with Australia and New Zealand, and leaving left outside all this, apart from, but still members of APEC, Hong Kong, China, as we call it in APEC, Chinese Taipei, again, as we call it in APEC, and Papua New Guinea and Russia. As you probably know, just in passing, that because of the inclusion of Hong Kong and Chinese and Taiwan in APEC, the convention developed in APEC that we never talk about countries or nations in APEC. That's so we don't want to talk about the one China policy. We just acknowledge it in the background by calling all APEC members APEC economies. Okay, so there I think I will switch now to ASEP. And we're getting very short of time, and I'm not sure if we'll have time for a breakout session, but I do want to talk about ASEP because I think ASEP may be one of the trade initiatives that has the best prospects for ASEAN in responding to the disruption that we are now seeing in international trade. So first of all, let's just look at how big the agreement is. Nearly 30% of world trade, 30% of world GDP, 30% of world population. It's a very big agreement. Other perhaps important thing to recognize is it brings together three integration processes that previously were separate. There's the integration within ASEAN among the APEC member states. There's the integration of ASEAN with 5 of its +6 partners, the other one being India, of course, but 5 of the +6 partners, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. And also probably the new element that was never present before, the, well, I'm sorry, I should have said no. Integration among the 5, I should have said that first, +6 partners. But also very importantly within that, the basis for finally achieving a free trade arrangement that includes all of China, Japan and Korea, which has never happened yet before. There have been attempts to create a China, Japan, Korea free trade agreement, which have always failed for different reasons. But within ASEP, those 3 countries are finally included in a single agreement involving all 3 of them. Okay, so there's a quick summary of some of the metrics of the RCEP for you to look at. And I will basically go quickly through this. There's this idea of what it's to be about that was set out right at the start, all the issues that were to be included. A key feature, I think, though, that we should mention is the emphasis that has always been present in RCEP on special and differential treatment, which is, and particularly for the CLMV states or CL, so I should say CLV, because I think Myanmar is not actually a member of the RCEP or hasn't actually been fully included. But that distinguishes from RCEP from the TPCPP, and that there's been much greater recognition of special and differential treatment for some ASEAN member states in the RCEP, flexibility, and also in terms of new membership. Both CPTPP and RCEP say that they're open to new members, which is very important, particularly in today's international trade world. In the case of RCEP, it's open to any other external economic partner, which I think in practice probably means any potential partner that is a dialogue partner. You can correct me on this. Any new member need to be a dialogue partner and possibly a signatory to the TAC, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. I'm not quite sure about that, but that may be the case. So different economies or countries that are implicated in RCEP have different priorities. Of course, APEC on the outside sees FTAP RCEP along with CPTPP as a building block for an eventual FTAP. East Asia sees this as the culmination of the efforts to achieve full integration in East Asia, and also particularly in the early years as an alternative to the TPP, and also a way of bringing India into that integration effort, of course, which was frustrated when India left. From ASEAN's point of view, I guess a very important thing here is that it can maintain ASEAN centrality for China, Japan, Korea. It was finally a godsend in terms of conveniently completing the free trade agreements between those three Northeast Asian economies. And from India, until it left, this was part of India's Look East strategy. I don't know what's happened with that since then, whether it's following a Look East strategy with individual East Asian economies, but that was the idea that India had in participating in the RCEP, which it no longer does, of course. And then for supporters of the rules-based multilateral trading system, you will have possibly seen that in some of the articles I've put on Canvas. From that point of view, RCEP really can be seen as consolidating East Asia's commitment to rules-based trade, which is an issue that we have seen mentioned again and again in the debates around international trade. This is a rules-based international approach to international trade that involves all of these 15 economies. Of course, the one member of the Asia-Pacific community that no longer seems to worry about the rules-based approach is the country that always seemed to be the main promoter of it, that is the United States, which is another story altogether, of course, which we talked about a bit earlier. And for New Zealand, at that time, it would have been, originally it would have been a first free trade agreement connection with Japan when the negotiations started, although Japan is now with New Zealand in the CPTPP, and also with India, and New Zealand still lacks any kind of free trade connection with India. So let's quickly look at the assessment, look at the content. It has all the chapters you would typically expect in an FTA. A big achievement is a single set of rules across the whole membership, across all 15 countries, which hasn't been there before. It has a single set of rules of origin, which is really important, or potentially really important for GB's global value chains and production networks. And so you have one rule of origin for each tariff line, which can be used by all member countries, although, of course, some of the earlier agreements still exist, and the rules of origin in those can still be used if countries prefer that. Improving trade facilitation by faster, easier processing of goods with common documentation requirements. There are liberalisation on all the usual things, tariffs, services, investment, but they do often have member-specific timetables and variations. The legal language turned out to be quite a lot stronger than some outside observers were expecting. And it also provides a platform for trade and economic, it's a very important thing, I think, a platform for trade and economic discussions in the region. And a critical part of the intention here was the proposed establishment of a secretariat, which so far hasn't happened, although at the end of last year we did see a RCEP support unit set up within the ASEAN Secretariat, which may be a step towards a secretariat, or whether that's going to be a substitute for a secretariat. We don't really know at this stage. So on trade and goods, yes, the tariff reductions are there. The initial reduction schedules are very complicated, and there are long phase outs of tariffs, and all the members have most of the members have member-specific schedules and timetables. But in the end, provided we get through that lengthy phase out, at the end, the schedule is for most tariffs, if not all, to reach zero. In terms of SPS, TBT, NTMs, safeguards, anti-dumping, as I mentioned yesterday, I think, there are WTO rules there for those issues, and the RCEP doesn't really provide much over and above those. But it doesn't also contradict them either. So those are still available to all the members, and there is no built-in agenda for further development of those issues within the RCEP. Rules of origin, I'm here drawing on the comments that were made in the ADB report, quite long report that I put on Canvas for you to look at. If you want to look at some of these assessments in more detail, the last 10 pages of that ADB report covers what they think about the provisions of RCEP, where the potential is or requirement is for further progress, etc. And what I'm saying here is very much consistent with what the ADB is saying. So rules of origin, the ADB thinks they're quite challenging for business, and that the rules on accumulation and certificates of origin in particular might need to be reviewed and further developed to make them more business friendly. Of course, there are alternative rules of origin available to some of the ASEAN, most of the ASEAN members within other agreements, East Asia-based agreements that they're party to. Services and investment, they built on the original foundations in ASEAN Plus FTAs. There's complexity. All members have different schedules of commitments. Some are using positive lists, some use negative list. Probably quite difficult for firms to untangle all this, but it seems that the intention is that all parties will move to a negative listing eventually. Or there's noted that least developed country members will need technical assistance for that. There's some quite helpful language in the services commitments on consistency with other rules, trade restrictive qualifications and licensing requirements, and some quite useful prohibitions on performance requirements. For example, no requirements on the number of branches to be set up or hiring of local staff or equity requirements. And on investment, there is, according to the ADB, meaningful market access, additional market access with a negative listing of non-conforming measures. But there still is no dispute settlement system for investors. E-commerce, and here I'm also referencing Deborah Elms. You heard Deborah Elms speak in the first session. She was heavily involved in the negotiations of the RCEP, so and these are some of her. She was very disappointed with the e-commerce outcomes of the RCEP, and this is really her take on it to a large extent. She felt that there was a potential there to have a very forward-looking agreement that would capture the advanced state of e-commerce in East Asia. But there were various individual economy or member concerns which mitigated against that. And so what ended up was a reaffirmation of commitments on the relatively easily agreed issues like electronic signatures, digital submissions on documents wherever possible, and so on. But you're going to hear much more about this in the section on digital trade, but you'll hear there that these are the key issues. Cross-border data flows, or some of the key issues, cross-border data flows, data localization details, customs moratoriums on customs duties for electronic transmission. These issues are only weakly included. And the key weakness in the language on exceptions, weakness is the language on the exceptions for measures undertaken for legitimate public policy objectives. And I mentioned this issue of governments always wanting to include exceptions on difficult issues like sometimes services, but also non-tariff measures, also now on e-commerce, to have a carve-out for anything they consider to be a legitimate public policy objective. And the RCEP, relevant RCEP provision says that the parties affirm that the necessity behind the implementation of such legitimate public policy measures shall be decided by the implementing party. In other words, there's no argument about it. If a member decides this is a legitimate public policy objective that's being addressed by this measure, that's the end of it. There's no room for argument. It's quite interesting on intellectual property. It covers genetic resources, traditional knowledge and folklore, which are, of course, of interest both to many least developed countries, but also to indigenous communities and also in developed countries, including New Zealand. And it also extends the fair use exception that we find in the TPP to cover trademarks as well as copyright. So it's not great on intellectual property, but it does have two, most agreements aren't, but it does have two quite useful provisions on intellectual property. And then the question is, well, the question that I might just about end with, there's obviously questions about implementation. Implementation really started only 2 years ago because it only entered into force in 2022, and I think most of the implementation probably started in 2023. There's, as normally in free trade agreements or preferential trade agreements, especially big ones like this, you expect to have to review the provisions, develop them further, make the agreement work better. And there have been several commentators, including the ADB, who have suggested that the RCEP would really benefit from having the permanent secretariat that it originally agreed to have, to support all this, to support and coordinate and implementation reviews and future developments. And to be fair, almost exactly the same comments have been made by other commentators about the CPTPP, but the CPTPP doesn't have a proper secretariat either. There is that opening up of the RCEP support unit within the ASEAN Secretariat. I'm not sure whether that's supposed to be the final solution or whether that's just a step towards the establishment of a full-scale secretariat, a RCEP secretariat. So there we are. I have managed to complete what I wanted to say about the RCEP, and I think you can see, I think, hopefully from that, the potential of the RCEP. We talked about in the initial session about the need for a trade response of the East Asian economies, including ASEAN, to safeguard their interests in the face of the disruption and the conflict that we're now seeing in the international trading system. And I made the point then, and I make it again strongly now, that I think East Asia is very, very fortunate, in my opinion, in having the RCEP. Commentators will say, well, it needs a lot of work to make it to realise its full potential for what it could do in the face of all the disruption and so on. But I mean, I think for me, as an outside, well, I think I should call myself an outside observer. For me, the RCEP is a very, very useful potential vehicle for the members to get together and use the RCEP to safeguard their trade and economic interests in the face of all the conflict and disruption that we are seeing today. Suzanne, I don't think we're going to have time for reporting back from the breakout session, but I think the participants might like to use the final minutes to have a breakout session to share their reactions among themselves, particularly over the RCEP and its potential role in the region. Does that make sense, that we perhaps have the breakout sessions even though we can't have the reporting back?
Yes, no, that makes sense. Just before, I'm happy to do that. I just was just checking the chat because there were a couple of questions, so maybe we could use also some of the 10 minutes that's left for Q&A.
Yeah, sure. Shall I try to reply to the chat questions while the breakout sessions are going on?
Yes. Okay. So we'll do maybe 6 or 7 minutes in the breakout room.
Okay.
Oh, actually, well, we could do 10. We can do 10 minutes, and then, yeah, if you're going to type the answers into the chat, then.
Yep, sure. I'll do what I can in the 10 minutes. Sure.
Okay.
All right.
All right. So I will open the breakout rooms now.
Selwas, are you there?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I was talking to Selwas. Okay.
See,
So how many minutes do we have? Sorry.
I'll bring them back in. I'll close them in 7 minutes. They'll be back in 8.
Okay. So are we going to have overtime today?
Basically, they're going to come back and we're going to do the karakia.
Okay.
So Rob's typing some answers to the questions that are in the chat while they share their thoughts with each other. And then, yeah, we'll close. So I don't know if you want to pop through each of the rooms, or I can maybe just pop through and see if they know what they're doing.
Yep, I will do that now.
Thank you.
I just want to say to all of you, thank you very much for being such a good audience and for being prepared to listen to me despite my fumbles with my computer. And I hope you found the sessions useful. Just to say one thing very quickly about today's session and the final part of it and the final breakout topic, what you may have gathered, what I've been aiming to do is to finish up by emphasizing the RCEP as one of the keys to East Asia's response to the global trade disruptions. And I hope I managed to convince you that the RCEP should be a very central part of any response from East Asia and certainly also from Australia and New Zealand, for example, to the trade disruption. But anyway, I leave that in your hands, and we'll see what you and your governments do about this as time marches on. Thank you very much for listening, and I wish you all very well. Thanks.
Thank Professor Suzanne
you,
and
Rob,
Grace for
Thank
today's
you,
class.
Rob.
Thanks,
See you next
Professor.
week.
So we
Thank
will
you.
post,
Next week,
yeah,
everyone. Yeah,
Professor.
take
Thank you,
care.
Professor.
Have a nice weekend, everyone.
Bye.
Yes,
Thanks,
thank
we
you.
will post the question on Canvas as well. So if you want to
Okay.
reflect on it
Thank
in
you.
your own time,
Thank
I
you.
will
Thank you,
post that.
Gay,
But
would you like to
Okay.
close?
we will
Thank you,
just close with the
Susan.
karakia. We will just close with the karakia and that, but a
Yes.
reminder that we will be seeing you next week. Okay. Same
Okay.
link, same Zoom link, and as usual, Wednesdays and Thursdays.
Okay.
So let's close with the karakia. Unuhiya, 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 kite uruta punui, kia watea, kia mama, te ngakao, te tinana, te wairua, kite ara tangata. Koyara e rongo, pakeria a ke kirunga, kia tina, huye, tai kia.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your
Bye.
day and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye. See
Bye,
you next week,
Dave. Bye,
everyone.
Suzanne.
Bye.
Thanks, Rob.
No, thank you for your support. I'm sorry for all my fumbling on the